In the autumn of 1095, in a field in the south of France, an aging man stood before a crowd and spoke for less than an hour. He had no army behind him, he wore no crown, he carried no chest of coin to press into anyone's hands. And yet, within 4 years, tens of thousands of people had sold the houses they were born in, cut crosses out of cloth and stitched them onto their cloaks, and set out on foot across more than 2,000 miles of unfamiliar earth, toward a city most of them knew only as a word spoken in church, in a language they did not understand. Many of them would never see it. They would lie down in country whose names they could not pronounce, and not rise again, undone by thirst, by fever, by an arrow out of the bright air. And what waited at the end of that road would be remembered, retold, and quarrelled over for very nearly 1,000 years. So let the room grow dim around you. If the thought pleases you, leave your city and the hour of your own night below. There is a quiet companionship in knowing that somewhere else, under a different sky, someone is settling into the same story you are. Rest your head. Let yourself begin to drift, and we will go back to where this began. To understand it, set down an idea that feels natural to us and would have meant nothing in the 11th century. One Christian world, whole and agreed with itself. There was no such thing. There were 2 great Christian civilizations, and they regarded one another across the map with something between suspicion and disdain. In the west lay the countries we would now call France and Germany, Italy and England, though none of them yet meant what those names mean today. They were a patchwork of small kingdoms and dukedoms and counties, ruled by armoured men who spent their lives fighting one another over strips of land, over insults, over grudges nobody could remember the beginning of. Latin was the tongue of their church. Their bishop in Rome, whom they called the Pope, claimed authority over every one of them, and kings ignored him whenever it suited. Far to the east stood the other Christian power, and it was an entirely different creature. This was the empire ruled from Constantinople, a vast, gold-heavy, walled city that later ages would learn to call Byzantine. The people who lived there would not have known the word. They called themselves Romans, for the plain reason that that is what they were. Theirs was the eastern half of the old Roman Empire, the half that never fell. Rome in the west had crumbled centuries before, but here the emperors still sat, the scholars still argued in Greek, the churches still burned with gold in the lamplight, and the memory ran back unbroken to the Caesars. To a rough-handed knight from the French countryside, such a place was barely imaginable. More people inside one ring of walls than any city he had heard named. More gold, more books than he could have counted. And the walls themselves, raised in the age of Theodosius, layered and towered and patient, through which no enemy had broken in 700 years. But by the hour our story opens, this old and proud empire was in a great deal of trouble. And the trouble had a name. Out of Central Asia had come the Seljuk Turks. They had converted to Islam and built an empire of their own across Persia and the Near East, and they were superb on horseback, riders and archers of a kind the Romans found very hard to answer. They pressed against the frontier in the wide highland country we now call Turkey, which was then Anatolia or Asia Minor. And Anatolia was no far-off province the empire could afford to shrug away. It was the heartland, where the soldiers came from, and the grain, and much of the wealth that kept Constantinople gleaming. The break came in the year 1071 at a place called Manzikert, near the eastern rim of that country. The emperor of the day, Romanos IV, marched out with a large army, meaning to settle the Turkish question for good. Instead, through ill luck, through orders that never arrived, and through treachery among his own commanders, his army came apart. The emperor was taken alive on the field, a humiliation almost without precedent for a Roman ruler. The Turkish Sultan, Alp Arslan, treated his prisoner with courtesy and let him go. His own countrymen were less generous. When Romanos made his way home at last, his rivals had him blinded, a thorough and permanent way of settling the question of who ought to rule. With the emperor disgraced and the palace in disorder, the defense of Anatolia simply stopped existing. Historians still argue over how much weight that single day ought to carry, whether Manzikert truly broke the empire, or whether the deeper ruin came in the civil wars that followed, when Romans turned their swords on Romans and left the gate standing open behind them. Because what came over the next 20 years was not conquest so much as drift. The Turks did not storm the heartland, they wandered into it. Byzantine generals, busy tearing at one another over the throne, invited Turkish warbands in as allies, paid them in land, and let them settle. Town by town, valley by valley, the heartland was given away in pieces by the very men sworn to hold it. By the 1080s, Turkish rulers held cities a short ride from Constantinople. A Turkish prince had made his capital at Nicaea, close enough that an emperor might well have imagined he could feel its breath on the back of his neck. Into that collapse stepped the man whose one decision would set everything else in motion. His name was Alexios Komnenos, and by the measure of his age, he was a magnificent survivor. Shrewd, patient, born of a powerful military family, and never too proud to bargain or flatter or quietly pay his way out of danger. In 1081, he took the throne in yet another coup and became the Emperor Alexios I. And what he inherited was an empire bleeding from every edge at once. The Turks pressed from the east. A fierce people called the Pechenegs came raiding down from the north. And from the west came the Normans, those restless adventurers out of northern France who had already taken England and southern Italy, and who now looked upon Byzantine land with open appetite. Alexios was, above all things, a realist. He understood that his empire could no longer raise the great armies of farmer soldiers it once had, for the simple reason that the fields which had fed those soldiers now belonged to somebody else. So he did the thing Constantinople had always done best. He went looking for other men to do his fighting. For centuries the city had hired its wars out, paying good gold to anyone who could hold a sword and keep a line. Even the emperor's own palace guard, the famous Varangians, were foreigners. Scandinavians for the most part, and increasingly Englishmen, exiles who had left their homeland after the Normans took it, and who now stood with their long axes in a golden hall at the far other end of the world. When Alexios began then to think seriously about winning back what he had lost, his gaze drifted westward, toward the one corner of the world that seemed to produce an inexhaustible crop of aggressive, heavily armoured, and thoroughly underemployed young men. Those Western knights were a problem searching for somewhere to happen. The custom of the age gave a nobleman's land to his eldest son, and very little to anyone else. A younger son might inherit a horse, a sword, and a temper, and nothing at all to put them to work on. So he hired himself out, quarrelled with his neighbours over boundaries and old slights, and made trouble because trouble was the only trade open to him. The Church had spent decades trying to cool this down, with movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, which tried, with mixed results, to forbid armed men from harming priests and peasants, or from fighting one another on holy days. Western Europe had a surplus of warriors, and nowhere near enough war to occupy them. Alexios, looking out at that from behind his unbroken walls, did not see a problem. He saw a resource. And so, in the early months of 1095, the emperor sent his ambassadors out on the long road west, carrying a request to the head of the Latin Church. They were asking for soldiers. Nobody knows the exact words they used, and historians still disagree about how large or how specific that request really was. The likeliest truth is a modest one. Alexios wanted what emperors before him had always wanted: a few thousand professional fighting men he could pay, direct, and send home again when the work was finished. Manageable help, to recover a manageable amount of ground. He liked to hold every thread in his own hand, and he meant to hold this one. His envoys found the Pope in March of 1095 at a great council of the Church in the northern Italian town of Piacenza. There, before a large gathering of clergy, they made their appeal. They spoke of Christians in the East living under the Turks, of holy places passing into the hands of strangers, of the danger leaning hard against the gates of the old Christian empire. They asked, simply, for men who could fight. The Pope listened. And this is where the story turns. The man holding that request had no interest in quietly arranging a small contract for hired swords. His own ideas were far larger and far stranger than anything Alexius had thought to ask for. The emperor had requested a tool. What would eventually come toward his city, in numbers no one on earth could control, was closer to a flood. His name was Odo, though history keeps him under the name he took when he was raised to the papacy, Urban II. He was French by birth, from a noble family in the north, and he had spent his early years as a monk at Cluny, the most celebrated and most rigorously disciplined monastery in Europe. Cluny was the beating heart of a movement to scour the church clean, of bishops who had simply bought their offices, of priests who lived like petty lords. Urban rose inside that movement, served as trusted assistant to an earlier reforming pope, and absorbed its central conviction to the bone, that the church was meant to lead Christendom, not merely to bless it. When he became pope in 1088, he inherited a fight that had very nearly destroyed the men before him. The popes of that generation were locked against the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in the West, over a question that sounds administrative and was, in fact, explosive. Who had the right to appoint bishops, the Pope or the Emperor? The quarrel, which historians call the investiture controversy, had turned so bitter that the Emperor once drove the Pope out of Rome and installed a rival pope of his own. For a time, Urban could not safely sleep in his own city. He governed a divided and embattled church from the road, moving through Italy and France, gathering allies where he could find them, watching for some way to restore the standing of his office. So when the Byzantine ambassadors arrived asking for soldiers, Urban did not hear a small administrative errand. He heard an opening of a kind that comes once in a lifetime. Here was a way to take the restless violence of Europe's knights and turn it outward, away from each other, toward a cause the church itself would name and direct. And here was a way to knit the eastern and western halves of Christianity back together, after a formal rupture only 40 years old, with the Pope, rather than any emperor, standing at the centre of the Christian world. Through the summer and autumn of 1095, he travelled across France, his own country, holding councils, sounding out bishops, gathering weight. The great gathering came in the last days of November, at Clermont, in the region of Auvergne, in the middle of the country. For more than a week, hundreds of bishops and abbots worked through the ordinary business of the church, matters of reform and discipline. But everyone there could feel that the Pope was holding something back. In the final days, he announced that he would give a public address, and that this one was not for the clergy alone. Word went out, and people came. Knights, townsfolk, farmers, far more of them than any church could have held. So a wooden platform was raised in an open field outside the city, and on a cold day at the end of November in 1095, Urban climbed up onto it to speak. And we do not know what he said. That is one of the strange, quiet truths sitting at the centre of this whole story. The single most consequential speech of the Middle Ages survives only in versions set down years afterward, by men straining to remember, or by men who had never stood in that field at all. Several such accounts exist, and they disagree with one another on the details, because each writer shaped the words to fit whatever the Crusade had by then turned into. What they do agree on is the direction of it. Urban told the crowd that their fellow Christians in the East were suffering terribly under the Turks. He described it in vivid terms, and almost certainly exaggerated ones. Churches defiled, pilgrims robbed and killed on the road, holy places in hands that did not revere them. And Jerusalem, he said, the city where Christ had lived and died, lay under the rule of unbelievers. Then came the appeal itself. He called on the fighting men of the West to stop spilling one another's blood over petty grievances and to lift their swords for a holy purpose instead. He urged them east, to the aid of their eastern brothers, and to the liberation of Jerusalem. And in exchange, he offered something extraordinary. Any man who went, not for plunder and not for glory, but out of devotion, would have his sins remitted. The journey itself would count as a complete penance, cancelling the punishment owed for a lifetime of wrongdoing. This was a world soaked through with the fear of damnation, and these were hardened men who had killed and sinned and lay awake in dread of the judgment waiting for them. Urban was telling them that the one skill they possessed, the skill their priests had always called sinful, could now carry them to heaven. By every account, the response broke over him like weather. The crowd roared, and the roar became the slogan of the entire enterprise. In their Latin and their rough country French, God wills it. People pushed forward to pledge themselves where they stood. A cardinal dropped to his knees and begged to be the first to take the vow. As a sign of that oath, those who pledged were given strips of cloth to sew in the shape of a cross onto their clothing. From that one small gesture comes a word we still use, because in the Latin of the Church, these people were signed with the cross. The word crusade did not yet exist. Nobody standing in that cold field called himself a crusader. They spoke of taking the journey, of going on pilgrimage, of taking the cross. The name we know came centuries afterward. To them it was a holy march, an armed pilgrimage of a kind nobody had quite attempted before. And Urban was no wandering enthusiast carried away by his own voice. He was a careful organizer, and he had thought the practical side through. He fixed a departure date for the following year, the Feast of the Assumption in the middle of August, 1096, sensibly after the harvest, so that the armies would have grain to carry. He named a leader to stand in his place on the road, a respected and capable nobleman bishop called Adhemar of Le Puy, who would serve as the Pope's own deputy and try to keep the whole unruly venture in one piece. He tried, too, to set limits on who should go. He discouraged the old, the sick, the unfit. Monks were to have their abbot's permission, priests their bishops. This was not a venture, he warned, for men chasing adventure or running from their debts. He wanted soldiers, organized and supplied, marching under proper commanders. What he got was something else, and it slipped out of his hands almost at once. After Clermont, he spent months touring France, preaching the message, and the idea caught in a way no medieval institution was built to manage. Letters and rumours ran ahead of him. Wandering preachers, a few of them authorized and a great many not, took up the call and carried it into towns and villages where the Pope's careful conditions were forgotten or had never arrived at all. The message grew simpler as it travelled, until a complicated appeal to aid the Eastern Church had worn down into a single thrilling promise: walk to Jerusalem, fight the enemies of God, and win heaven. It is worth pausing on how strange that was. The emperor in Constantinople had asked for a modest band of paid soldiers to help him take back some farmland in Anatolia. He had said nothing whatever about Jerusalem, which lay hundreds of miles beyond anything he hoped to recover, and which had rested in Muslim hands for more than 4 centuries, open enough to Christian pilgrims all the while. Within a single year, his quiet request had swollen into a movement spanning a continent, aimed at a city he had never mentioned. Historians still turn the question over, whether Jerusalem was Urban's intention from the first, or whether it grew into the goal in the retelling, carried there by the crowds rather than by the Pope. The enthusiasm spread fastest among precisely the people Urban had tried to wave away. Long before the great lords had finished gathering their knights and selling their estates to pay for the road, the message had reached the poor, the desperate, and the simply faithful of northern France and the Rhineland. They had no intention of waiting for August. They did not understand that an expedition of this size needed money and supplies and seasoned men to command it. They had heard that God willed it and that Jerusalem was waiting, and that was enough. And so the first people to set out on the long road to the Holy Land were not armoured knights on war horses. They were a vast, ragged, dangerously hopeful crowd, following a barefoot preacher on a donkey. Their journey came first, and it ended in disaster. The man who lit the fuse among the common people held no bishopric and owned no land. He was called Peter the Hermit, and he came out of the country around Amiens. By the accounts of those who saw him, he was unforgettable, short and dark, wrapped in a coarse woolen cloak, riding a donkey, eating almost nothing, going barefoot. He had a gift that all of Urban's careful planning could not match. He could move a crowd to tears and then move it to its feet. Wherever he went, through northern France and on into the German lands of the Rhineland, people pressed in around him to touch his cloak or to pull a hair from the donkey and keep it as a relic. God has called you, he told them, all of you. There is no need to wait for armoured lords or appointed dates. The road to Jerusalem is open now. The crowd that gathered to him was unlike any army the world had yet seen. There were a few genuine knights among them, and minor lords, men like Walter, who carried the unhappy byname sans avoir, meaning without possessions, and whom history has kindly rendered as Walter the Penniless. Most of those walking behind him, though, were nothing of the kind. They were farmers who had sold their tools, tradesmen who had shuttered their shops, women and children and the old, the poor, and a good many of the simply desperate, all carried along by a conviction that the world might be nearing its end, and that Jerusalem was the place to be standing when it came. They had little money, almost no supplies, and only the haziest sense of how far the Holy Land actually lay. There is a story, true at least to the spirit of the thing, that the children on the march would point at every large town they came to and ask whether this one, finally, was Jerusalem. And before this great unruly mass had even left Western Europe, it produced the first tragedy of the Crusade and one of the darkest passages in European history. As bands of the movement gathered across the Rhineland in the spring of 1096, some of their leaders, most infamously a German count named Emicho, turned a terrible logic on their own neighbours. Why walk thousands of miles to fight the enemies of Christ abroad, they asked, when men they had decided were enemies of Christ lived in the streets around them? They meant the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, settled and prosperous in cities like Speyer and Worms, Mainz and Cologne. What followed was a series of massacres. Thousands of Jewish men, women and children were killed by these mobs, offered a choice between conversion and death that was no choice at all. In several cities, the local bishops opened their own gates and tried to shelter their Jewish neighbours, sometimes at real personal risk. Sometimes those defences held. Sometimes they were overwhelmed. The Church had called for nothing of the sort. The Pope's appeal had pointed east. But violence, once let out of the house, does not go where its preachers point it. Historians still argue about what drove Emicho and the men like him, whether it was apocalyptic conviction, or plunder, or the simple arithmetic of debts that vanish along with the people who hold them. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland set those months down in their own chronicles and carried the memory for generations. The main body of the People's Crusade, meanwhile, started down the old road that armies and pilgrims had used for centuries, through Central Europe, along the Danube, across the Kingdom of Hungary and into the Byzantine Balkans. The basic problem of the venture revealed itself almost at once. A crowd of many thousands with no supply train and no money still has to eat. When the local people would not sell them enough food, or could not, the pilgrims simply took it. Fields were stripped, livestock driven off, and tempers rose into open fighting. At more than one town, what began as a quarrel over the price of grain ended as a battle, the pilgrims storming the place and the garrison cutting them down in return. By the time the survivors came within sight of Constantinople, in the high summer of 1096, they had already lost a great many of their number, and not one of them to a Turk. They had lost them to hunger, to sickness, and to the very people whose lands they believed they were marching to save. When that ragged host settled outside his walls, Alexios found himself facing precisely the problem he had feared, in a shape he could never have imagined. He had asked for disciplined professionals. What had arrived was an enormous camp of starving civilians and the occasional knight, with a barefoot preacher at its head, hungry, easily excited, and inclined to carry off anything not fastened down. Alexios, careful manager that he was, did the sensible thing. He sent gifts and money. He granted Peter an audience, and then he arranged to ferry the entire crowd across the narrow water of the Bosphorus and out of his city, onto the Asian shore. "Wait there," he told them. "The great armies of knights are still gathering far behind you. Do not go provoking the Turks on your own." It was excellent advice. It was almost entirely ignored. On the Asian side, the discipline that had never really existed fell apart completely. The pilgrims raided the countryside around them, which now belonged to the Turkish Sultanate of Rum, and was ruled by a young and very capable sultan named Kilij Arslan. They quarrelled among themselves and split into rival companies, one mostly French, the other mostly German and Italian, each determined to outdo the other. Some rode right up beneath the walls of the Sultan's capital at Nicaea. One band seized a small fortress and was surrounded there by Turkish forces, offered that same impossible choice of conversion or death, and killed in any case. Peter the Hermit, watching his followers ignore every warning and drift toward the edge, gave up trying to hold them and sailed back across to Constantinople to beg for help and supplies. As it happened, he was absent for the catastrophe he had spent months walking toward. It came in October of 1096. A rumour ran through the camp that the German and Italian company had taken Nicaea itself and was dividing the spoils. Enraged at being left out, the rest of the host poured out onto the road toward the city from their camp at Civitot, marching in no order at all, the old and the women and the children strung out behind the fighting men. Kilij Arslan had been waiting. His horse archers came down on that long, unguarded column and broke it almost at once. The Crusaders were driven back in a rout, run down, and killed in their thousands. Some reached the camp and made a stand there. A few hundred got as far as an old, ruined castle beside the sea and held out until ships from Constantinople came to lift them off. Most of the rest were killed or taken away as slaves. So the People's Crusade, which had set out tens of thousands strong, certain that God walked beside them, ceased to exist within months of leaving home, without ever coming within many hundreds of miles of Jerusalem. For Kilij Arslan, the victory was complete and easy, and it taught him something that would turn out to be dangerously wrong. He had met the warriors of the West, scattered them with almost no effort, and concluded that these people were a rabble, brave enough perhaps, but no true threat to his power. On the evidence in front of him, it was a reasonable judgment. He would have a great deal of time, later, to reconsider it. Because the crowd he had just destroyed was not the army the Pope had summoned. Peter himself lived. He would find his way back to the enterprise in time, and walk on toward Jerusalem in the company of the lords, a smaller figure by then, no longer a man who could summon a continent's poor with a lift of his hand, but present at the end, all the same. Behind him, along the Anatolian shore, the bones of his followers lay where they had fallen, and Greek sailors passing that coast in later months reported that the Turks had gathered them into a long marker, so that anyone sailing by would know the place where the first wave had broken. And while those thousands were dying for a city they would never see, the real expedition was finally assembling behind them. All through that same year, across France and Germany and Italy, the great lords had been doing the slow, expensive work the poor had been too impatient to wait for. They mortgaged castles, they sold estates outright, they gathered knights and foot soldiers, wagons and provisions, and bound themselves by oath to the long road east. These were men of an entirely different order from a barefoot preacher on a donkey. Princes with armies behind them, and ambitions and rivalries running in several directions at once. It is worth noticing that not one reigning king took the cross. Philip I of France had been excommunicated over a scandalous marriage, and was in no condition to lead a holy war. The German emperor, Henry IV, was the Pope's bitter opponent in their long quarrel over bishops. The King of England had no interest whatever. So the leadership fell to the rank below, to the most powerful noblemen of the age, every one of them accustomed to being obeyed, and none of them accustomed to obeying. First in wealth and standing was Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, who ruled much of the south of France. He was the eldest of them, somewhere past 50, experienced, devout, and proud. He had already fought Muslims in Spain. He was enormously rich, and he announced that he was taking the cross for good, vowing never to return home. He brought his wife with him. He plainly expected to be recognized as commander of the whole enterprise, and the fact that Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the Pope's own deputy, travelled in his company only deepened that conviction. From the German-speaking lands came Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, with his brothers Eustace and Baldwin. Godfrey was tall and fair and famously pious, well regarded as a soldier, if not as clever in a room as some of his rivals. To pay for the journey, he did what nearly all of them did, stripping his estates, selling and mortgaging lands and rights to buy horses, weapons and supplies. His younger brother Baldwin was a sharper article altogether, a man with little land of his own and a clear eye for the main chance. And Baldwin would turn out to be one of the most consequential figures in the entire story. The most dangerous of them, at least by the reckoning of the Byzantines, was Bohemond of Taranto. He was a Norman out of southern Italy, son of Robert Guiscard, the famous adventurer who had carved a kingdom for himself in Sicily and the south, and spent years trying to take Byzantine land as well. Bohemond had faced the Emperor Alexios in the field before, on the losing side, and the two men knew and distrusted one another thoroughly. He was huge, charismatic, quick-minded, and entirely self-interested. A man who looked at the Crusade and saw, above all, a principality waiting to be won. Historians still weigh how much faith there was in him at all, or whether the cross on his cloak was simply the best road available to a landless younger son with a great name. With him rode his nephew Tancred, young, tireless, and every bit as ambitious. From the north came others. Robert, Duke of Normandy, eldest son of William the Conqueror, brave and likeable and hopeless with money, raised his funds by mortgaging the entire Duchy of Normandy to his younger brother, the King of England, for 10,000 marks of silver, which gives some sense of what these men were prepared to stake. Robert, Count of Flanders, joined too, a seasoned campaigner whose own father had served the Byzantine Emperor. And there was Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest men in France, married to a daughter of the Conqueror, cultured, comfortable, and rather reluctant, who would write long and vivid letters home to his wife from the road, and who would in time become the great cautionary tale of the expedition. Hugh of Vermandois, brother to the French king, completed the company, bringing royal blood if not royal authority. It is worth pausing here to look at the world these men came out of, because the army now forming was, in miniature, a portrait of medieval Europe itself. People of the time liked to picture their society as three groups: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. Those who prayed were the clergy, from great bishops who lived like princes down to village priests who lived like their parishioners. Those who fought were the nobility and their knights, who held land in exchange for military service and regarded war as both birthright and trade. And those who worked were nearly everyone else: the peasants, most of them serfs bound to the soil they farmed, who fed the other two orders and owned almost nothing themselves. A knight was an expensive thing to make. His war horse alone might cost as much as a small farm, and he needed more than one. His armour was a long shirt of mail, thousands of small iron rings linked together by hand, worn over padded cloth, with a conical helmet and a shield shaped like a kite. He fought with lance and sword, and he had been training for it since boyhood. All of that cost so much that the fighting class was, by definition, a wealthy one, standing well above the foot soldiers who walked beside it. Noblemen wore fine wool and linen dyed in colours that announced their rank, trimmed with fur and silk. They ate well by the measure of the age: meat at most meals, white bread, wine in the south and ale in the north, and spices carried in at great expense along the very trade routes that ran through the lands they were preparing to invade. The people below them lived in another world altogether. A peasant ate bread, dark and coarse, and pottage, a thick soup of grain and whatever the season had given up, with meat as a rare luxury. Their clothes were undyed wool and rough linen, the same garments worn until they came apart. They lived in 1 or 2 rooms of timber and mud, often sharing the space with their animals through the winter for the warmth. Their years were shaped by 3 things: the seasons, the Lord's demands, and the Church's calendar of feasts and fasts. When people like that took the cross, and many thousands did, walking as foot soldiers and servants behind the mounted lords, they were leaving the only world they had ever known to go toward a place they could barely picture. And for every one of them, noble and common alike, the vow was a heavy and frightening thing. This was no season's campaign. The journey to Jerusalem and home again, for anyone lucky enough to make the return, would take years. It meant walking away from house, family, and livelihood, with no assurance of seeing any of them again. It cost a fortune to those who had one, and for those who had nothing, it meant handing their whole fate to the road. The vow was sworn before God, and to break it invited excommunication. So men settled their debts. They made peace with old enemies. They gave gifts to monasteries in exchange for prayers for their souls, and they put their affairs in order, exactly as a dying man does, because a great many of them expected to die. Through 1096, these separate armies gathered and began to move. They did not travel as one body. No single road could feed so many mouths, and the leaders had no appetite for merging their forces and quarrelling over command earlier than they had to. So they agreed to meet at the one place that made sense, the great city on the water between Europe and Asia. From there, the routes fanned out. Godfrey of Bouillon took his Lorrainers overland down the long Danube road through Hungary, the same path the People's Crusade had taken, though Godfrey held his men on a far shorter rein. Raymond of Toulouse brought his southern French along the rough Adriatic coast, a miserable passage through the mountains of Dalmatia. The northern French crossed into Italy, meaning to take the short sea route from there, and Bohemond assembled his Normans in southern Italy and shipped them straight over the narrow water to the Byzantine shore, advancing through the very country he had once tried to take by force. Tens of thousands of fighting men, and behind them a countless tale of servants, clergy, women and camp followers, all converging on a single point from 3 directions, drawn by faith, by ambition, by the hope of land or glory, or a clean soul. To the emperor watching them come, the sight must have been deeply unsettling. He had asked for help. What was descending on his capital was an armed migration. And so the most dangerous phase of the Crusade so far began, not on any battlefield against the Turks, but inside marble halls and behind guarded gates. The first to arrive was Hugh of Vermandois, the French king's brother, and his reception set the tone for everything after. Hugh had been shipwrecked crossing the Adriatic and washed up on the Byzantine coast in a sorry condition. Alexios received him with great honour, heaped gifts on him, gave him fine lodgings, and treated him precisely as his royal blood deserved. He also, very politely, made it almost impossible for Hugh to leave until certain understandings had been reached. That was the pattern he would use again and again. Warmth and courtesy on the surface, and underneath it, a grip that did not loosen. Alexios had thought hard about how to handle these Westerners, and his caution was earned. He remembered Bohemon's father marching through his provinces not long before. He had just watched the People's Crusade move through his territory like locusts through a field. Now several full armies were arriving at his gates, each with a proud lord at its head and ideas of its own, and together they far outnumbered the troops he could safely keep inside the city. He wanted their help against the Turks, and he wanted it on his own terms. From each leader he wanted two things above all. The first was an oath of loyalty, binding them to him as a vassal is bound to his lord. The second, and far more concrete, was a solemn promise that any city or territory they took, which had once belonged to the empire, would be handed back to him. He had no intention of helping a pack of adventurers cut kingdoms for themselves out of ground he still considered Roman. Historians still ask whether the two sides ever understood those oaths in the same way at all. To get them sworn, Alexios used everything he had. He received the leaders with overwhelming ceremony, seated on his throne in robes stiff with gold, surrounded by the wealth and ritual of a court built over centuries, all of it arranged to make a rough Western count feel very small indeed. He gave away staggering quantities of gold and silver, fine cloth and jewels, knowing how short of money most of them were. And when charm and generosity fell short, he applied a simpler pressure. He controlled the markets and the flow of food, and he discovered that a lord who would not swear while comfortably fed often grew more reasonable once the provisions stopped arriving. As methods of encouraging agreement go, it is difficult to improve on. The confrontation that came closest to wrecking everything involved Godfrey of Bouillon. He arrived with his army and refused at first to swear the personal oath. He had already given his loyalty to the German emperor, and he could not see why he should now kneel to a Greek ruler he had met a week earlier. The standoff dragged on through the winter. Godfrey's men, camped outside the walls and growing hungry and bored, began raiding the suburbs. Alexios closed the markets. The Crusaders attacked. So there was real fighting outside Constantinople, Crusader against Byzantine, before either side had so much as laid eyes on a Turk. In the end, Alexios brought up his own seasoned troops and gave Godfrey's army a check sharp enough to make the point. Outmatched in the emperor's own back garden, and persuaded he would get no further without terms, Godfrey swore. And Alexios, the gracious victor, immediately buried him in gifts and good food, and the crisis passed. Then came Bohemond, the old enemy, and he surprised everyone. The Norman who had once tried to take Byzantine land for himself arrived wreathed in smiles. He swore the oath without a murmur, and urged the others to do the same. Bohemond was nobody's fool. He was playing a longer game. He hoped to win the emperor's trust, and perhaps a grand title and a command in imperial service, a foothold from which to build something of his own. Alexios, who knew precisely what Bohemond was, accepted the oath with equal warmth and equal insincerity. The two of them understood each other perfectly, which is to say, not at all. The hardest case was Raymond of Toulouse, who considered himself the senior man of the whole enterprise. He refused outright to swear vassalage, declaring that he had taken the cross for God and would accept no earthly lord but the one he already served. He and the emperor argued at length, and in the end they found a compromise. Raymond would not swear the full feudal oath, but he gave his word to respect the life and honour of the emperor and to do nothing against his interests. It was less than Alexios wanted. It would do. The haggling left Raymond and Bohemond watching each other with deep suspicion, and that rivalry would shadow everything that followed. While the lords bargained, their followers wandered the greatest city in the Christian world with their mouths open. Nothing in Western Europe had prepared them for it. Perhaps 500,000 people lived inside those walls, at a time when a large Western town might hold 10,000. There were paved streets, public squares, aqueducts, markets selling goods from the far ends of the known world, churches past counting, and over it all the enormous dome of Hagia Sophia, a building so vast and so beautiful that visitors gave up trying to describe it. And the city was crammed with relics, fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, the bones of saints and apostles. Men who a year earlier had treasured a hair pulled from a preacher's donkey now stood in rooms full of such things, and they marvelled. Some of them, being who they were, also worked out how much of it might be carried away. The Byzantines watched the newcomers with a mixture of fascination and alarm. Brave, they thought, but crude, greedy, quick to anger, and dangerously unpredictable. They lumped every one of them together under a single word, whatever country they had actually come from. They called them the Franks. We know how they saw these men because of one extraordinary source. The emperor's own daughter, Anna Komnene, grew up to be a scholar and long afterward wrote a great history of her father's reign, the Alexiad. It is among the most valuable records of the Crusade from the Greek side, set down by a princess who had watched these lords parade through her father's court as a girl. She found them by turns admirable and appalling. She described their leaders with a sharp and sometimes wickedly observant eye, marvelling at Bohemond's presence in a room and at the reckless courage of the Frankish knights, who she thought would ride straight through the walls of hell itself if somebody pointed them at it. Historians handle her pages carefully, since she wrote decades later, with a daughter's loyalty and the knowledge of how it all turned out. Once each leader had come to terms, Alexios did exactly what he had promised, and rather more efficiently than the Crusaders had any right to expect. He gave them food, money, and open markets. He gave them guides who knew the country and the enemy in it. He arranged ships to carry their armies across the Bosphorus to the Asian shore, the same short crossing he had used to hurry the People's Crusade out of his sight, though this time he was sending soldiers. And he attached to the expedition a force of his own men under a trusted general named Tatikios, whose task was both to help the Crusaders and to take formal possession, in the emperor's name, of every city they recovered. On paper, it looked like a sound partnership. The Franks would fight. The Byzantines would supply and guide them. The lost provinces would come home to the empire, and the Westerners would march on to Jerusalem. But the foundation was rotten with mistrust from the first day. The Crusaders believed they were doing the empire an enormous favour, and resented being made to swear like servants. They suspected, not unreasonably, that the Greeks would be glad to let Franks bleed for land the emperor would then quietly pocket. Alexios, for his part, was certain these grasping Westerners would take whatever they could and keep it, oaths or no oaths. Both sides were right about the other. The alliance held only because each needed the other. The Crusaders for supplies and safe passage, the emperor for men willing to die reclaiming his frontier. By the spring of 1097, the gathering was complete, and the armies were crossing into Asia. For the first time, The full weight of the proper crusade stood on Turkish soil. Tens of thousands of fighting men, no longer the hopeful and hungry poor, but an army of the European nobility, fed and guided by the resources of the Byzantine state. Ahead of them lay the Sultanate of Rum, and the same Kilij Arslan who had scattered the People's Crusade in an afternoon, and still believed the Franks were nothing much to worry about. The first test of the real crusade waited at the strong-walled city guarding the road into the heart of Anatolia. Nicaea was a place with a long memory. The Turks held it now as their capital, but it was an ancient city, ringed with heavy stone walls and better than 100 towers, and it was famous in the Christian world for something that had happened there more than 7 centuries before. It was at Nicaea, in the year 325, that the first great council of the Church had met and worked out the statement of belief that millions of Christians still recite on Sundays. So this was no ordinary target. It was a holy city in enemy hands, and taking it back would be the first solid proof that God approved of the march. It was also very hard to attack. The walls were thick and high, and the western side of the city rested against the broad water of a lake, which meant no besieging army could ever close the ring. As long as that lake stayed open, food and men could come and go by boat, and a city that can be resupplied can hold out more or less forever. The Crusaders came up in May of 1097 and pitched their camps along the land walls, each lord taking a section. Godfrey on one side, Bohemond on another, Raymond of Toulouse arriving later to seal a further gate. They settled down to besiege a place that, by the rules of war, could not really be besieged. They had one piece of luck. The Sultan was not at home. Persuaded by his easy victory at Sivetot that these Westerners were no threat, Kilij Arslan had marched east to deal with a rival Turkish power, leaving his capital, his treasury, and his own wife and children behind with a modest garrison. When word reached him that an enormous new army was camped outside Nicaea, he understood his error at once and came back at speed with every man he could gather. In the middle of May, he threw that army at the besiegers, striking the sector held by Raymond's southern French. It was a long, hard day, and at the end of it, the Crusaders were still standing, and the Turks had been thrown back with heavy losses. It was the first time the knights of the proper crusade had met the Turks in the open field, and they had won. Kilij Arslan, shaken by the strength and the discipline of these new enemies, drew off into the hills. He sent word to the city that he could not save it, and that its defenders should make whatever terms they could. They fought on anyway, because surrender meant putting themselves at the mercy of an army they had every reason to fear. The fighting around the walls was grim. The Crusaders built siege engines and tried to bring the towers down by digging beneath them, and in one ugly piece of theatre, the chroniclers record, without much comment, they used their catapults to send the remains of the dead back over the walls to frighten those inside. The garrison held, and the lake at their backs kept them fed no matter what happened on land. The siege threatened to run on for months, and the army outside could not feed itself forever. The answer to the problem of the lake is one of the more memorable feats of the whole campaign. The Crusaders sent to Alexios, who had established himself not far off, watching closely without committing his main army. The emperor arranged for a fleet of boats, but no waterway joined the sea to that inland water, so the boats were lifted onto wagons and rollers and dragged overland by oxen and by men, mile after mile across dry ground, and launched at last onto the lake on the far side of the city. One morning the defenders of Nicaea looked out over the water that had been their lifeline, and found it covered with imperial warships flying the emperor's banners. The last gap had closed. The city was ringed now on land and water both, and there was no longer any question how it would end. What happened next left a taste that never entirely went away. The Crusaders made ready for the final assault, expecting to take the place by storm, and by the brutal custom of the age, a city taken by storm could be plundered and its people killed. The common soldiers in particular had been counting on that plunder to pay them back for months of hunger and fear. But Alexios had no interest in watching his recovered capital sacked, its wealth scattered, and its people slaughtered, least of all when he intended to rule it himself. So his agents quietly opened talks with the Turkish garrison, offering honourable terms if they surrendered to the emperor rather than to the Franks. The garrison offered a choice between the merciful Greeks and the bloodthirsty Westerners, took the deal without hesitating. On the 19th of June, the Crusaders rose for what they expected to be the great day of the assault, and found imperial troops already inside the walls and the emperor's banners hanging from the towers. Nicaea had surrendered in the night, and not to them. The mood in the camp turned to sullen fury. They had done the fighting and the dying and the long waiting in the mud, and at the final hour the slippery Greeks had lifted away both the glory and the loot. Worse still, to their eyes, Alexios treated the captured garrison and the Sultan's family with elaborate courtesy. Kilij Arslan's wife and children, taken in the city, were sent to Constantinople, and in time released without ransom. To the emperor, this was simple good sense, a way of keeping a channel open to the Turks and behaving as a civilized ruler ought to behave. To the Franks, who had been hoping to enrich themselves and to settle the account for the comrades left on the shore at Civitot, it looked like proof that the Greeks were schemers, fonder of arrangements than of the holy cause. Historians have argued it ever since, statesmanship, or the first crack in an alliance that would not survive the journey. The emperor knew he had bruised them, and he set about soothing the bruise in the way he understood best. Gifts went out among the leaders and down among the soldiers, gold enough to take the edge off the anger, and with them fresh assurances of support. He did not, however, march on with them. He had recovered his most valuable lost city without fighting a single great battle of his own, using the Franks as a battering ram and stepping forward at the end to take the prize. From where he sat, the arrangement was working beautifully. From where they sat, a grievance had been planted, and over the coming months it would grow into open resentment, and then into a quiet conviction that oaths sworn to a partner like that need not bind a man forever. Whatever the bad feeling, though, the gain was real. The capital of the Sultanate of Rum had fallen. The road into the interior lay open, and the crusade had passed its first test as a fighting force. The army that left Nicaea at the end of June was confident, blooded, and for the moment well fed. The leaders decided to advance in 2 columns, partly so that the country could feed them, since no single stretch of land could supply grain and fodder for the whole mass at once, and partly so they could cover more ground. Bohemond and the Normans took the vanguard, with Robert of Normandy and others alongside. Godfrey, Raymond, and the rest followed at a distance behind. It was a sensible decision, made for sound, practical reasons. It was also precisely the sort of decision an alert enemy waits for. Kilij Arslan had been beaten at Nicaea. He had not been finished. Burning with the humiliation of it, he had spent the intervening weeks patching up his quarrels with rival Turkish lords and assembling a great army of horse archers, the finest light cavalry anywhere in the world, men who could ride and shoot together with a speed and an accuracy no Western knight could answer. He had learned at Nicaea that these Franks were not the crowd he had swept aside the year before, so now he meant to catch them strung out on an open road, one column too far from the other to be helped. He found his chance a few days into the march, on a dusty plain near a place called Dorylaeum. On the morning of the 1st of July, 1097, the forward column made its camp in a broad valley beside the ruins of the old town. This was Bohemond's vanguard, with Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Stephen of Blois, and the Byzantine general Tatikios among them. The larger second column, with Godfrey and Raymond and Bishop Adhemar, lay perhaps a day's march behind. Somewhere along that road, the 2 halves of the army had drifted further apart than was wise, and Kilij Arslan had been waiting for exactly that. At first light, the Turkish army came down on the camp. It was an enormous force, far larger than the one thrown back at Nicaea, for the Sultan had made peace with rivals he had lately been fighting, among them the powerful Danishmend emir, and had drawn horse archers from across Anatolia. Historians treat the numbers the chroniclers give with great caution, since a frightened man on the receiving end of that morning was in no position to count. But everyone who was there agreed there seemed no end of them. They swept around the column in a wide, fast-moving ring, and they fought in a manner the Westerners had never properly met. These were not knights riding in to trade blows at close quarters. They were mounted archers, lightly armoured and superbly trained, who came in near, loosed a storm of arrows, and wheeled away again before the heavy cavalry could close. They filled the air with the thunder of drums and a high, wailing war cry meant to unsettle the nerves, and they seemed to be everywhere at once. Here, then gone, then back from another direction entirely. For the knights it was a nightmare. Their whole art of war rested on the charge, on striking a line at full gallop with couched lances and breaking it by sheer weight and shock. But there was no line to break. When they charged, the Turks scattered before them like water and closed again behind, and the arrows came from every side at once. A knight cannot catch a horse archer. While he wore out himself and his horse chasing shadows across that plain, the arrows kept falling, killing the horses, wounding the men, wearing the army thin. More than one Western chronicler admitted, with a kind of grudging respect, that they had never faced soldiers of this quality. Bohemond, whatever else he was superb in a crisis. He understood immediately that to fight the Turks at their own game was to die, and he gave the order that saved the day. The knights were not to ride out, they were not to chase. The whole column was to draw back onto a patch of ground sheltered by a river and its marshy reeds, with water at their backs, so that the ring could never quite be closed around them. There, the army packed itself into a tight defensive mass. The non-combatants, the women and the clergy, the servants and the baggage, were gathered into the middle. The foot soldiers and archers held the outer edge, and the knights, many of them dismounted now to spare their horses, stood in behind as the hard core and the reserve. The order was to hold, only to hold and to wait. It was a brutal way to spend a summer morning. For hours the Turks circled and shot, and the Crusaders stood in the heat and took it, unable to strike back to any purpose, their losses climbing, their water running low, the arrows coming out of the bright air with no one to answer. The women of the camp moved among the ranks carrying water to the wounded and the exhausted, and the chroniclers, who seldom troubled to mention such things, made a point of writing it down. More than once the line bent and nearly gave, the Turks pressing in where it thinned, scenting the end of it. Bohemond rode the perimeter, steadying his men by being visible. And at the very beginning of the fight, he had done the other thing that mattered. He had sent fast riders back along the road to find the second column and beg them to come with everything they had. Now the whole morning hung on whether that help would arrive before the ring closed. It came around midday. The riders had found Godfrey and Raymond and the rest, who drove their men into a punishing forced march under the summer sun and reached the field with the day still in the balance. Fresh Crusader knights went straight into the Turkish horsemen, who had been so intent on the trapped vanguard that they were caught flat-footed by a threat from a new direction. Then Bishop Adhemar, the Pope's own deputy and a far better soldier than his office suggested, led a detachment on a wide loop through the hills and came down on the Turks from behind. All at once the encirclers were themselves enclosed, the stubborn defenders in front of them, the relief column on their flank, and Adhemar at their back. An army that fought brilliantly while it held speed and surprise had no answer to being pinned. The whole host broke and ran, leaving everything behind. The Crusaders came forward over the Sultan's camp and took his tents, his treasure, his herds, and provisions enough to feed them for weeks. Kilij Arslan got away. His army did not, and neither did his strategy. The losses had been heavy on both sides. The Crusaders had lost good men and a great many horses. But they had been ambushed at a disadvantage, divided and surrounded, and they had come through it standing. Dorylaeum proved that this was not the People's Crusade. Properly led, these Westerners could absorb the worst the Turks could throw, and still be there at the end of the day. The consequences went deep. Twice beaten inside a few weeks, the Sultan drew the obvious conclusion. He could not stop this army in the field, so he stopped trying. He gave up on another great battle and turned to something that would prove far more dangerous than any cavalry, falling back ahead of the Crusaders and ruining the land as he went. Crops burned, wells filled in or fouled, livestock driven off. Nothing left standing that an army could eat or drink. Historians still debate how thorough that scorched country really was, and how much of the suffering that followed was simply the plateau being what it is in July. Either way, the effect was the same. He would let the country do his fighting. The Crusaders had broken the door into Anatolia. The long road across its interior would not be disputed by soldiers at all. It would be disputed by heat and thirst and distance. They carried some hard lessons away from Dorylaeum. They learned to respect the horse archers. They learned to keep their columns within reach of one another, and never again let half the army wander a full day ahead of the other half. They learned the worth of holding formation under fire, and of mixing infantry and crossbowmen among the knights, so that the foot could keep the enemy at arm's length, while the heavy cavalry waited for the moment that was actually worth charging into. The lessons were expensive and paid for in blood, but the army that marched on was tougher and wiser than the one that had left Nicaea. What waited for them, no amount of soldiering could prepare them for. For weeks they pushed across the central plateau, high, dry and scorching, stripped of anything useful. The sun was without mercy. The wells were ruined, and what food they carried ran low. Men died of thirst on the road, dropping out of the column to be left where they lay. The animals suffered worst. The war horses, the pride and the weapon of the knightly class, died by the hundreds, until great lords who had ridden out of Nicaea in polished mail found themselves walking like common soldiers, or perched on oxen and pack mules, their armour and gear lashed onto whatever beast still had legs, goats and sheep and hunting dogs among them. It made for a strange and humbling procession, the flower of European chivalry creeping across a wasteland on the backs of farm animals. A year earlier, the poor had followed a preacher on a donkey and been laughed at for it. Now, the greatest lords in the West were riding whatever they could find. Eventually, the country softened. They passed Iconium, the city we now call Konya, which the Turks had emptied and abandoned before them, and there were orchards again, and running streams, and grass for what animals were left. The worst of the thirst was behind them. A different ordeal waited in the mountains. To reach Syria and the road to Antioch, the army had to cross the Anti-Taurus range, and that passage was among the most miserable episodes of the entire campaign. The tracks were narrow and steep and slick with mud and rain, clinging to the walls of deep ravines, and somewhere in these weeks the host began to change shape. Ambition and opportunity would pull a piece of it away eastward, where one of the leaders saw a chance to win himself a city and a title, and in taking it, would found the first of the Crusader states, far from Jerusalem, on the banks of a distant river. That man was Baldwin, the younger brother of Godfrey, the sharp one with little land of his own, and his road ran toward the Armenian city of Edessa. Pack animals lost their footing on those tracks and went over into the gorges, dragging their loads down with them, and where beasts were roped together, one falling animal could pull the whole line after it. Knights who had sold estates to buy their armour now tried to sell it again for a pittance, or simply left it on the path rather than carry it another mile. The chroniclers, who were rarely given to complaining, wrote about that stretch of road as a place of genuine horror. Beyond the mountains, the land changed, and so did the people in it. The army came down into Cilicia and the borderlands of Syria, country with large populations of Armenian and Syrian Christians who had lived under Turkish rule for generations. They belonged to different churches than the Latins, worshipped in different ways, used different words for the same holy things. It made no difference. They greeted the Crusaders as fellow believers and as men who might free them. After months of walking through emptied and hostile country, the army found friendly faces, open markets, and guides who actually knew the roads. For the leaders, it opened something else as well. Here were Christian towns ripe to be taken back from the Turks, and certain ambitious men began thinking rather less about distant Jerusalem and rather more about what might be picked up along the way. Two of them in particular. Tancred, Bohemont's nephew, and Baldwin, Godfrey's younger brother, each led a detachment away from the main body into the towns of Cilicia, taking places like Tarsus and Adana and Mamistra in the name of the Crusade, and increasingly in their own. Over Tarsus, the two of them came very close to open war, their men actually skirmishing with one another over the spoils. It was an early and ugly signal that the unity of the enterprise held only so long as there was nothing worth quarrelling about. Tancred eventually came back to the main host. Baldwin had larger ideas, and circumstance had cut him loose to pursue them. He was a younger son with nothing to inherit, and his wife had died on the march, so there was no estate and no family drawing him homeward. A man with everything to win and almost nothing to lose is exactly the sort who gambles, and Baldwin gambled. He turned east, away from the army, with only a small band of knights, toward the Euphrates and the old, rich city of Edessa. It lay deep in Armenian Christian country, far off the Crusades' line of march, and comfortably beyond anything the emperor could plausibly claim as Roman. Edessa was a place with a remarkable history. By its own proud tradition, it had been among the first cities anywhere to accept Christianity, and it treasured a legend that its ancient king had exchanged letters with Jesus himself, and received in return a miraculous likeness of his face, a relic pilgrims still came a long way to see. It was wealthy, it was well fortified, and it sat squarely across the approaches between Anatolia and the wider Muslim world. The city was governed by an Armenian Christian named Thoros, an unpopular ruler hemmed in by hostile Turkish neighbours and badly in need of a strong protector. When Baldwin arrived with his hardened Western knights, Thoros saw precisely the ally he had been praying for. He welcomed him in, loaded him with gifts, and then, having no son of his own, took the extraordinary step of formally adopting this foreign lord as his heir. The ceremony was a strange one. Following the local custom, Baldwin and the elderly Thoros were made to stand together inside a single enormous shirt, pressed chest to chest as father and son to seal the bond between them. Whatever Baldwin privately thought of standing in a shirt with an old man, he understood the value of it at once. He was now the named successor to the lordship of Edessa. And he did not have to wait long, which raised eyebrows even at the time. Within weeks, the people of the city, who already loathed Thoros, rose against him in a sudden and violent revolt. Thoros was pulled down and killed, and Baldwin, the newly adopted heir and the only man in Edessa with a real fighting force at his back, stepped smoothly into the empty lordship. How much he knew of the rising beforehand, and how much he quietly helped it along, the sources do not say, and historians have been arguing about it ever since. Baldwin was not the sort of man to leave a written confession. What is certain is that by the early spring of 1098, Baldwin of Boulogne, who had crossed into Asia owning nothing, ruled a great city and the country around it. This mattered for reasons far beyond one man's fortunes. The county of Edessa, as it came to be called, was the first of the Crusader states, founded more than a year before the crusade reached the goal it had set out for, and founded squarely against the spirit of every oath sworn in Constantinople. Baldwin had taken it for himself, and he meant to keep it. It set the pattern. The notion that a crusading lord might cut out a permanent domain of his own in the east, rather than liberate a place and hand it on, had now been tried and had worked. Bohemond, watching from a distance, will certainly have noticed. He had ambitions of exactly the same shape, fixed on a far greater prize that the main army was at that very moment approaching. And for the crusade as a whole, Baldwin's coup turned out to be an asset. Whatever the other leaders thought of his methods, Edessa was rich, and Baldwin, secure in it, was able to send money and food and supplies west to the main army at the precise moment it would need them most. His city also covered the eastern flank of the expedition, blocking the road along which forces from Mesopotamia might have come down on the host from behind. By accident or by design, the First Crusade state made the whole venture stronger. But Edessa, profitable as it was, remained a sideshow. The bulk of the crusade had gone on through Syria, drawing closer to the obstacle everyone knew would be the hardest thing they had yet faced. Antioch was one of the greatest cities of the ancient and the medieval world, immense in size, immense in its defences, and immense in what it meant to both sides. It was the gate into Syria, and the last great stronghold standing across the road to Jerusalem. Taking it would not be the work of a few weeks. What the Crusaders were about to begin would consume the better part of a year, and it would come nearer to destroying them than any battle did. They reached the walls in October of 1097, and the sight must have sobered even the confident ones. This was among the oldest cities of the eastern Mediterranean, a centre of trade and learning since antiquity, and one of the cradles of the faith itself, the place where the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. Its defences were on a scale nobody from Western Europe had ever seen. The walls ran for miles, studded with more than 400 towers, climbing from the riverbank up the steep flank of a mountain called Silpius, with a citadel perched on the summit above everything. To take such a place by direct assault was unthinkable. It would have to be starved, and to starve it, the army had to surround it. And here was the bitter arithmetic. Large as the Crusader host was, it could not stretch far enough to close that perimeter. The Turkish governor, a hard and experienced commander named Yagi Sian, understood this perfectly well. He settled in to wait, confident of keeping at least some of his roads open through the gates that faced the mountain. So began one of the longest and cruelest sieges of the Middle Ages, in which the besiegers would suffer quite as much as the besieged. The first weeks went well enough. It was autumn, and the orchards and fields around the city were heavy with fruit and grain. The Crusaders, with the recklessness of men who have recently been starving, ate their fill and then some, slaughtering animals and feasting as though the harvest would go on forever. It did not. By the time winter set in, they had eaten through the whole countryside, and what they had not eaten they had spoiled or simply neglected to store. Then came the cold. The winter of 1097 into 1098 was savage. Freezing rain drove through the camp, the river rose and flooded, and men lay shivering in sodden tents with nothing to put in their stomachs. Famine took hold and tightened its grip month after month. The chroniclers set down what people ate, in order: the war horses first, then the pack animals, then dogs and rats, then the leather of their own harness, and at last roots and thistles pried out of the frozen ground. The price of any scrap of food climbed past reach. Sickness moved through the weakened, filthy camp, and men died not by the dozen, but by the 100. The cavalry of the crusade nearly ceased to exist. Fit war horses fell from many thousands to a few hundred, so that knights who could no longer mount either fought on foot or did not fight at all. Under that kind of misery, the will of a great many men simply gave way. Desertion became a serious problem, soldiers slipping off in the dark to try for home. Even prominent men lost their nerve. Peter the Hermit, who had set the first wave of all this in motion, tried to leave the camp and was caught and brought back in disgrace. A sad ending for the preacher, whose cloak people had once torn at for relics. The most damaging departure was Tatikios. Early in the new year, the Byzantine general announced that he was going to arrange supplies and reinforcements, and rode away. And he did not come back. Historians still debate what actually happened there, whether he fled a hopeless situation, went on a genuine errand, or was quietly maneuvered out of the camp by men who found his presence inconvenient. Whatever the truth, the Crusaders chose to read it as proof that the Greeks had abandoned them at the worst hour of their lives. Bohemond, in particular, filed the grievance away with great care. It would be extremely useful to him later, when he wished to argue that the oaths sworn in Constantinople no longer bound anybody. The men inside the walls were not idle either. Yagisian sent urgent appeals to the great Muslim powers of Syria, and he made life hard for the city's considerable Christian population, whom he no longer trusted, expelling some and imprisoning others. Twice during that long winter and spring, armies came to break the siege. The first, out of Damascus, was intercepted by a Crusader foraging force at the end of 1097 and turned back after a hard fight. The second was more serious. In February of 1098, the ruler of nearby Aleppo advanced with a substantial army. Bohemond took command and met him on a narrow strip of ground between a lake and the river, where superior numbers could not all be brought to bear at once. Conserving his few precious horses, he fought the action with real skill and broke the relief force, sending it running back toward Aleppo. Those victories kept the siege alive. They did not end it, and they did nothing whatever to fill an empty stomach. Relief for the besiegers came not overland, but from the sea. The Crusaders held the nearby port of St. Simeon, and through it help began to arrive. Ships out of Genoa and a fleet from England, carrying food, timber and building materials, craftsmen and tools. With that, they could at last begin to close their hand in earnest. They threw up fortified positions to block the gates that had stayed open, raising siege castles opposite the bridge and the mountain approaches, and slowly strangled the routes by which the governor had been feeding his garrison. The road between the port and the camp was dangerous ground, swept by sorties from the city, and a great many men died keeping it open. But the supplies came through, and as the spring of 1098 came on, the balance began, very slowly, to tip. And then, just as the ring around Antioch was finally closing, far worse news started making its way toward them. Far away in Mesopotamia, the ruler of Mosul, a formidable warlord named Kerboga, had been convinced that this Frankish invasion was too dangerous to be left alone. He was assembling an army larger than anything the Crusaders had yet met, drawing contingents from across the Muslim East, and he was coming to relieve Antioch and finish them. If he arrived while they were still camped outside the walls, they would be caught between the fortress in front and an overwhelming host behind, pinned in open ground and destroyed. The siege had turned into a race. They had to be inside Antioch before Kerboga came up, and after 7 months in the mud beneath those towers, they were no nearer to breaking in by force than they had been in October. It was at that point that Bohemond produced the scheme he had been quietly nursing. The walls could not be stormed, but walls are only ever as loyal as the men standing on them. Bohemond had opened a secret correspondence with one of the captains of the garrison, an officer who commanded a stretch of towers on the southern side, a man named Firuz, who was willing to let the Crusaders in. His reasons are lost to us. The chroniclers suggest a grievance against the governor and a healthy interest in reward, and it may well have been fear as much as either. Bohemond took his proposal to the other leaders wrapped in a condition. He would get them into Antioch. In return, the city would be his to keep. The princes, exhausted, frightened of the army marching toward them, and unable to produce any better idea, agreed reluctantly. Raymond of Toulouse was the most resentful of them all, because he saw exactly what Bohemond was doing and could do nothing whatever about it. The bargain struck, the trap was set. On a chosen night in early June of 1098, with Coburga's army only days off, Firouz made ready to open his towers. He was as good as his word. In the darkness, a small party of crusaders came up to the foot of his tower, and a ladder went up against the wall. The first men climbed in near silence, took the neighbouring towers, dealt with the guards, and threw open a gate. Bohemond's banner rose on the heights above as the signal, and the men who had been waiting in the dark poured into the city they had sat outside for 8 months. What followed was the brutal, ordinary reality of a city taken by storm. As dawn came up, the Crusaders surged through the streets of Antioch, and in the confusion and the fury of the breakthrough, they killed without much care for who was a soldier and who was not. And in the chaos, some of the city's own Christians died alongside their Muslim neighbours. Yagi Sian, who had defended the place so stubbornly for so long, fled in the panic and was killed by local people in the hills outside, and word of it was carried back into the city before the day was out. By nightfall, the Crusaders held Antioch. They did not hold all of it. High above the rooftops, on the peak of the mountain, stood the citadel, a powerful fortress in its own right, and into it had withdrawn a Turkish garrison under the dead governor's son. They shut the gates and held firm. So after everything, after the winter and the famine and the dying, an enemy still looked down on them from the rock above, waiting for its moment. There was no time to do anything about it, because the race they had been running was already lost. 2 or 3 days after they broke in, dust rose on the horizon, and Coburga of Mosul arrived with the largest army the Crusade had ever faced. Men who had spent the previous night celebrating in captured houses climbed the walls in the morning and looked out at a plain filling with tents. In a single stroke, the whole situation inverted. The besiegers were now the besieged, shut inside Antioch with an enormous host ringing the walls outside and a hostile garrison on the height above, free to come down into the streets whenever it chose. They had traded one trap for another, and the new one looked considerably worse. It is worth pausing on how narrowly they had escaped total disaster, and on why. Coburga could have reached Antioch before it fell. Had he done so, he would have caught the Crusaders in the open and made an end of them. But on his way, he had stopped to besiege Edessa, meaning to extinguish Baldwin's new little state first and secure his rear before dealing with the main army. Edessa held out against him for 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks were exactly the time the Crusaders needed to bribe their way through a tower door. So Baldwin's controversial adventure on the Euphrates, the one the other leaders had grumbled about as self-serving, had, without anyone intending it, bought the entire crusade its survival. Historians have enjoyed that irony ever since, though they still argue whether Coburga's delay was a blunder or simply the reasonable caution of a commander who did not wish to leave an enemy fortress behind him. Survival, in any case, was still very much an open question. They had captured a city with nothing left in it to eat. 8 months of siege had already stripped Antioch and the country around it bare, and now the men inside found themselves starving all over again, worse than before, with no port to bring them relief and no fields left to forage. The famine came back with everything it had. Men ate whatever they could lay hands on, and morale, already worn thin by months of misery, came apart altogether. Night after night, soldiers let themselves down the walls on ropes and slipped away into the dark. So regularly that the chroniclers coined a mocking name for them. They called them the rope dancers. The army that had just conquered Antioch was visibly falling to pieces inside it. The most consequential desertion, though, had happened a little earlier, and its effects reached far beyond one man's reputation. Stephen of Blois, The wealthy and cultured count who had written such warm letters home to his wife had fallen ill, or said he had, and left the camp shortly before Bohemond's night attack. From a safe distance, he watched Coburger's host assembling, concluded that the crusade was finished, and turned for home. And on the road north, he met the Emperor Alexius, who was at that very moment marching south with an army to support them, precisely the relief the men in Antioch were praying for. Stephen told him the situation was hopeless. The Crusaders were surely destroyed already, or would be within days, and there was nothing left to be gained by going on. Alexius was a cautious man, with no wish to walk his army into a disaster and lose it for nothing. He believed Stephen. He turned around and went back. When the Crusaders eventually learned of this, it finished whatever trust still survived between them and Byzantium. The emperor had been coming to help them, and at the one moment that counted, he had turned away and left them to it. And Bohemond, who wanted Antioch for himself and needed some reason to walk away from the oath that promised it to Alexios, could not have been handed a better gift. The emperor's failure to arrive became, in Crusader eyes, a desertion that cancelled every promise sworn in that gold-heavy throne room. As for Stephen, he carried the name of coward home with him, and the shame of it would eventually drive him east again on another expedition, where he died, his honour repaired at the cost of his life. Inside the city, through the middle of June, the Crusaders endured something close to the edge of collapse. Coburger pressed his attacks against the walls and around the base of the citadel, and the half-starved defenders threw him back, again and again, at a cost they could not afford. The worst of it was on the slopes below the citadel, where the garrison above and Coburger's men outside kept trying to link hands and cut the city in two. The Crusaders fought uphill on empty stomachs and just barely held. The leaders met in grim councils, where even the boldest of them had run out of suggestions. They were trapped, outnumbered, starving, surrounded, with no relief on the way and no visible road out. A great many people believed the end was simply a question of when. And it is in moments like that, when the ordinary kinds of hope have been used up, that people reach for other kinds. What happened next has been remembered as a miracle, or dismissed as a desperate piece of theatre, depending entirely on who is telling it. A poor pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew came before the leaders with a story. He was nobody in particular, a man of low birth, by some accounts not even especially respectable, no priest and no holy man, just one more follower trailing along behind the army. But he was insistent, and his account was full of detail. Over several nights, he said, St. Andrew had appeared to him. The saint had rebuked the Crusaders for their sins, and then promised them deliverance, and had given him a sign to prove it. Buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter, there in Antioch, lay one of the holiest objects in Christendom, the lance that a Roman soldier had thrust into the side of Christ upon the cross. Find it, the saint had told him, and the victory would follow. It would be the proof that God had not abandoned them after all. To a starving, frightened army with nothing left to lose, that was not a small promise. It was a spark thrown into dry tinder. The leaders were divided over whether to believe a word of it. Raymond of Toulouse embraced the vision wholeheartedly, and his own chaplain became its most devoted recorder and its loudest promoter. It did not escape notice that the relic would belong, in a sense, to Raymond's faction, lending him a spiritual prestige at exactly the moment when Bohemond was winning every worldly argument between them. Bishop Adhemar was a good deal more sceptical. He was an educated and sensible man, and he had a specific reason to doubt. He had seen, in Constantinople, among all those chapels of gold and silver full of fragments of the true cross and the crown of thorns, a relic displayed as the very same holy lance. Two of them, one in Constantinople and one buried under a church in Antioch, was rather difficult to credit. But Adhemar was also wise enough to read the mood of a desperate army, and he did not denounce the vision publicly. The hope it offered was worth too much to smash. So they dug. On a day in the middle of June, 1098, a party of men worked in the floor of the cathedral, watched by an anxious crowd, turning over earth hour after hour and finding nothing at all. As the day wore on and the pit gave up only soil and rubble, the doubters in the crowd began to speak more loudly. Then Peter Bartholomew himself climbed down into the hole. He scrabbled about in the dirt at the bottom of it, and he stood up holding a piece of iron, which he raised over his head and proclaimed to be the head of the Holy Lance. To those who believed, it was a miracle, and proof beyond argument that God had not turned his face away. To the doubters, it looked very much like a man who knew precisely where to dig, producing an object he could as easily have put there himself the night before. But nobody said so out loud. Inside that trap, with an enormous army camped outside the walls and nothing to eat within them, the skeptics held their tongues, because the effect on the men was immediate and it was overwhelming. An army that had been leaking away over the walls every night became, almost overnight, a body of fervent believers who were certain that God was about to take the field on their side. Other visions followed quickly, as they tend to at such times. A priest reported that Christ himself had appeared to him with promises of help. There was talk in the camp that the crusaders who had died along the long road, the ones left on the burning plateau and in the mountain gorges, would rise and come back to fight beside the living, led by the warrior saints of the Eastern Church, St. George and St. Demetrius and St. Mercurius, mounted on white horses and clothed in shining armour. The whole emotional weather of the army swung, in a matter of days, from black despair to a burning and slightly wild confidence. And the leaders, who knew perfectly well that they could not hold out much longer in any case, made the bold decision that this new mood made possible. Rather than sit still and starve, they would march out of Antioch and offer open battle to a far larger army, trusting to their renewed faith and to the divisions they hoped to find among their enemies. Before the battle, they did what their faith required. They fasted, which, under the circumstances, was not difficult. They confessed their sins. They walked in solemn procession through the streets of the city they had bled for. They also tried diplomacy of a sort. Peter the Hermit, his earlier disgrace apparently forgiven, or at least quietly set aside, was sent out as an envoy to propose terms, and perhaps to suggest settling the whole question by a contest of champions. Kaboga, supremely confident in his numbers, dismissed the offer with contempt and sent him back with nothing. He had these people trapped and starving. He saw no reason to bargain with men he expected to crush at his leisure. But his position was nowhere near as strong as it appeared, and his greatest weakness was the army itself. His host was a coalition, assembled out of contingents belonging to many different rulers across Syria and Mesopotamia, lords who distrusted one another thoroughly and distrusted the ruler of Mosul rather more. Several of them had no wish at all to watch Kaburga destroy the Franks and emerge as the master of the whole region. They had come because they could not easily refuse, and they were watching for a reason to leave. Kaburga had failed to win their loyalty, and his overconfidence did nothing to help. The Crusaders were counting on precisely this fragility, whether or not they understood the details of it. On the morning of the 28th of June, 1098, the gates of Antioch opened, and the Crusader army marched out to give battle. They came in ordered divisions, one after another, crossing the bridge over the river, each lord leading his own battalion, priests walking beside them in their vestments and praying aloud, and the Holy Lance carried up in the middle of them like a banner of God's favour. Most of the men were on foot, because the horses were very nearly all gone, and they were thin and weak with months of hunger. By any sober reckoning, they should have been swept off that plain within the hour. Kaburga made his first mistake there. He could have struck them as they crossed the bridge, breaking each division before the next had time to form. Instead, perhaps meaning to draw the whole army out and destroy it in one piece, he let them deploy without interference. Once the line was formed, the battle went faster than anyone expected. The Crusaders advanced steadily. Attempts to work around their flanks were met and held. And then the thing they had been hoping for happened. As the fighting developed, whole contingents of Keberga's allies simply pulled off the field. The resentful emirs choosing that moment, of all moments, rather than spend their men on another man's glory. Whether it was that defection, or the unexpected steadiness of a starving enemy, or the fires set in the dry summer grass, or the warrior saints on white horses that the Crusaders swore afterward they had seen riding down to help them, Keberga's great army lost its cohesion, and then lost its nerve. The withdrawal became a flight. Historians have picked over the causes ever since, without settling them, though most agree that the coalition was cracked before the first blow landed. The host that had trapped the crusade broke and ran, abandoning its camp, its supplies, and its treasure on the ground. And the half-starved crusaders, scarcely able to credit what they were looking at, found themselves masters of the field. The victory was total, and by every reasonable expectation, it was impossible. The Turkish garrison up in the citadel, watching Keberga's army scatter across the plain below, understood that no help would be coming and offered to surrender. There was an immediate and very telling quarrel about whom they should surrender to, Bohemond or Raymond. It was Bohemond's banner that went up over the citadel, and everyone in Antioch understood what that meant. They had been delivered from certain destruction, and a great many of them never doubted for a moment that the lance had done it. That relic would not keep its glory long. In the months ahead, the doubts would grow. The rivalry between Raymond's faction and the skeptics would sharpen, and Peter Bartholomew would eventually be pressed to prove his honesty in the most drastic manner anyone could devise, by walking through fire. But all of that was still ahead. For now, the crusade had come through its darkest hour and won its most astonishing victory, and the road to Jerusalem lay open again. And having escaped the trap together, the leaders promptly did what victorious allies so often do. They began to quarrel over the spoils. The great prize of Antioch became the bone in a dispute that would stall the march to the Holy City for months. It was high summer. The season was brutal for marching, and the army was exhausted and thinned. But the heat was not the only reason they stayed. The deeper cause of the long pause was a single, bitter question. Who would rule Antioch? Bohemond's claim was simple and entirely self-serving. He had engineered the capture of the place through his private arrangement with a captain of the garrison. The other leaders had agreed beforehand that the city would be his if he got them inside. And the emperor, to whom Antioch had been promised under the oath sworn in Constantinople, had abandoned them on the road when he turned his army around. The oath, Bohemond argued, was therefore dead, and the city was his by right. Against him stood Raymond of Toulouse, of all people, now the proudest defender of the agreements with Byzantium, insisting that the oath still bound every man who had sworn it, and that Antioch must be held for the emperor, or at the very least, not simply pocketed by a grasping Norman. Raymond's motives were not purely high-minded. He held a few key positions inside the city himself, and he had no wish whatever to watch his great rival become a sovereign prince. So the two camps glared at one another across a divided city, Bohemond holding the citadel and most of the streets, Raymond clinging to the palace and the bridge, and the march to Jerusalem simply stopped. The Crusaders sent word to Alexios, inviting him to come and take possession in person and settle the argument that way. The emperor, cautious as ever and by now thoroughly distrusted, did not come. Historians still weigh whether that was prudence or a calculation that the Franks would exhaust themselves and he could collect the pieces later. Whatever lay behind it, the delay played straight into Bohemond's hands. Every month that passed without an imperial banner appearing made it easier to argue that Byzantium had forfeited its claim. They wrote to Pope Urban as well, the man who had started all of this in a cold field in France, reporting their astonishing victory, begging him to come east himself and lead them on to Jerusalem, and asking him to settle the question of who should govern the church in the lands they had taken. Urban never came, and in one of the sadder ironies in the whole of this story, he died in the summer of 1099 without ever learning that the enterprise he had launched had succeeded. The news of Jerusalem reached Rome just after his death. The voice that had set 100,000 people walking never heard how the walk ended. The crusade had also just lost the one man who might have held it together through all this. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the Pope's representative, the patient mediator who had calmed the quarrels and steadied the morale and given the expedition a voice that everyone would listen to, died on the 1st of August, 1098, taken by an epidemic that swept the Crusader ranks in the foul aftermath of the siege. The sickness was probably typhoid, bred in the filth and crowding of a year of camp life, and it killed thousands besides him. His loss cannot really be measured. He had been the closest thing to a neutral authority that these proud men would heed, and without him, the rivalries ran on unchecked. For a while, the epidemic scattered the army, the leaders withdrawing to separate towns to escape the sickness and to keep their men fed. And that scattering turned, predictably enough, into another round of quiet land-taking. Instead of turning south, the lords spent the autumn and early winter of 1098 capturing and garrisoning towns in the country around Antioch, extending their holdings, installing their own men, and, in Raymond's case, even planting a Latin bishop in a captured town to shore up his position. Each of them was building a base of power in Syria, hedging against the possibility that the real rewards of this expedition lay not in a distant city in the hills, but right here, in rich land already in hand. The holy purpose that had carried them out of Europe was in genuine danger of being mislaid altogether, somewhere in the paperwork of carving up Syria. What saved it was not the princes, it was the ordinary crusaders. The common soldiers and the poor pilgrims who made up the bulk of the host had not crossed a continent, buried their friends on a burning plateau, and starved through 8 months beneath the walls of Antioch in order to stand around while their betters haggled over Syrian market towns. They had come for Jerusalem. Their patience was running out, and through the autumn and winter their anger grew louder and considerably more dangerous. They began to say openly that if the lords would not lead them on, they would elect a leader of their own and go without them. In some accounts they swore to pull down the walls of the disputed towns, and of Antioch itself if it came to that, on the sound reasoning that if there were no fortress left to argue about, the argument would end, and the excuse for staying would go with it. It was that pressure from below, far more than any agreement reached among the princes, that finally set the crusade moving again. Faced with a mounting fury he could not ignore, and seeing a chance to take back the moral leadership that Bohemond's worldly success had stripped from him, Raymond of Toulouse changed course. If he could not have Antioch, he could be the man who led the faithful to the holy city, and that might, in the end, be worth more than any single town. Early in 1099, he made the decisive move. He assumed the role of leader of the march, gathered everyone willing to follow him, and set out south at last. And to shame the others into coming, he is said to have walked at the head of the column on foot, as a humble pilgrim, the richest man in France going barefoot down a road that a preacher on a donkey had once promised was open to everyone. It worked. Godfrey, the 2 Roberts, Tancred and the rest, unwilling to be left behind and to hand the glory of the final triumph to Raymond alone, fell in and marched south too. One man did not. Bohemond stayed where he was. He had what he had come for, a great city and the makings of a principality of his own, and he had no intention of risking it by walking off to Jerusalem. So the most brilliant soldier of the entire crusade, the man whose cunning had opened Antioch and whose generalship had broken Kaburga on the plain outside it, stepped out of the holy war on the threshold of its goal and became the ruler of Antioch, founder of the second of the Crusader states. His ambition was satisfied. The pilgrimage could go on without him. And so, after months of delay that had nearly pulled the whole enterprise apart, the army turned its face south again, smaller than it had been, missing some of its ablest men, but still formidable, and carrying a determination that everything it had suffered had only sharpened. Ahead lay the long road down through Syria and into Palestine, and it would have to be managed with more care than swords alone could provide, because the political ground to the south was nothing like the ground they had fought across in the north. The Turks, who had ruled Syria and Anatolia, were Sunni Muslims, loosely bound into the Seljuk world, and they had been the enemy at Nicaea, at Dorylaeum, and outside the walls of Antioch. But the southern lands the army was now walking into, the coastal cities of Lebanon and Palestine and the prize itself, had lately passed to a rival Muslim power altogether, the Fatimid Caliphate, ruling from Egypt. The Fatimids were Shia, and they regarded the Sunni Turks as bitterly as any Christian did. Indeed, while the Crusaders had been starving outside Antioch, the Fatimids had taken Jerusalem from the Turks themselves. The Muslim world the Crusaders were entering was deeply divided against itself, and that division would do as much for them as any victory of their own. The Fatimids, sensibly, had no wish to fight these Franks if it could be avoided, and they had spent months trying to reach an understanding. They had sent envoys during the siege of Antioch, proposing something like an alliance against the common Turkish enemy, and offering the Christians free and protected access to Jerusalem as pilgrims, so long as they came peacefully and in modest numbers. It was a reasonable proposal, and from where the Fatimids sat, a generous one. It also completely misread the men it was offered to. These people had not walked across the world to visit Jerusalem as guests under someone else's protection. They had come to take it and to keep it, and no amount of pilgrim access was going to answer that. The talks went nowhere, and the army marched on toward a city the Fatimids now had to defend. There was one more costly delay before they reached it, and it brought the strange affair of the Holy Lance to its grim end. Raymond of Toulouse, still hungry for a domain of his own, sat down to besiege a town called Arca, near the wealthy coastal city of Tripoli, hoping to win a foothold in the region. The siege dragged on for weeks, then months, and achieved nothing at all, and the ordinary crusaders, who had heard this song before, grew furious at yet another self-serving halt. It was during that stalled siege that the long simmering doubts about Peter Bartholomew finally boiled over. The skeptics, whose suspicions had only grown since Adhemar died, accused him openly of fraud. And to defend the relic, his own honour, and the prestige it lent to Raymond's faction, Peter agreed to prove the truth of his visions by the ancient test of the ordeal. He would walk through fire and trust God to bring him out unharmed. In the spring of 1099, before an enormous crowd, 2 long heaps of dry branches were set alight, with a narrow path left between them. Peter Bartholomew, carrying the lance, walked into the flames. He came out the other side, and he was terribly burned. Whether the fire alone did that, or whether the frenzied crowd pressing in around him made his injuries worse, he died of his wounds a few days afterward. His death settled nothing cleanly. His defenders insisted he had passed the test and been hurt only after it. His accusers took the whole thing as plain proof of a lie. Historians have never been able to close the question either, which is perhaps the most honest verdict available. But the spell was broken. The lance that had lifted a doomed army off the floor at Antioch lost most of its hold on men's minds, and Raymond lost with it a good deal of the spiritual authority he had built on top of it. Under all that pressure, Raymond gave up the pointless siege at last, and the army turned south again, this time without distraction. From here, the Crusaders showed that they had learned something about moving an army through hostile country. Rather than besiege every town along the coast, which would have taken years they did not have, they went quickly down the coastal road, and the local Muslim rulers, keen above all to see the back of these dangerous strangers, were glad to speed them along. The cities of the Lebanese and Palestinian shore, places like Tripoli and Beirut, Sidon and Acre, sent out food, money, horses and guides, and bought their safety with tribute and gifts. Both sides understood the arrangement perfectly well. The Crusaders wanted Jerusalem, not these towns. The towns wanted the Crusaders gone, not dead. So the army that had once crawled across the Anatolian plateau, dying of thirst, with its armour lashed to goats, now swept down the coast well-fed and unopposed, covering in weeks a distance that the fighting in the north had cost them months. As they neared the goal, they turned inland, leaving the easy road for the rougher hill country that climbs toward Jerusalem. The Fatimid governor of the city was a capable commander, and he had been preparing. He strengthened the walls. He laid in supplies and brought in a strong garrison. And knowing that the summer would fight on his side, he set about destroying or fouling the wells and cisterns in the countryside all around, so that any army sitting down outside his walls would find itself parched in the dry heat, exactly as another commander had once emptied the plateau ahead of them. As a precaution, he also expelled or restricted the local Christian population, fearing they might open a gate from within. Jerusalem was not going to fall easily. And then, after everything, they saw it. On a day in early June of 1099, the army came over the last ridge on the road from the coast, and there it was. After 3 years of marching and fighting and starving and burying their friends, after some 2,000 miles of road that had begun in a field in France with an old man's voice, the city stood in front of them. The reaction from everyone who was there to record it was overwhelming. Hardened soldiers wept without shame. Men went down on their knees and pressed their faces into the dust. Many pulled off their shoes to walk the last stretch barefoot, as humble pilgrims approaching a holy place, exactly as a preacher on a donkey had once walked. The hill from which they first caught sight of it was given a name that means the Mount of Joy. And the joy was real, the particular kind that comes only after long suffering, when a thing endlessly hoped for and half given up on stands plainly in view at last. But the host, looking down on Jerusalem that day, was a shadow of the movement that had left Europe. Of the tens of thousands who had sown on the cross, walked through Hungary, gathered at Constantinople and crossed into Asia, only a fraction was still standing. Disease, battle, hunger, desertion, and the long detours of ambition had worn the ranks down to perhaps 12 or 13,000 fighting men, with a tail of pilgrims and non-combatants behind them. The figures are estimates, and historians argue about them, but every account agrees on the shape. They were very few, and they were a very long way from home. And they were about to attempt the hardest thing they had yet tried. Storming a great walled city held by a determined garrison in the burning heat of a Palestinian summer, with almost no water and almost no timber to build the machines they would need. There was also a clock running, the same kind of clock that had nearly finished them at Antioch. The Fatimids would not give up Jerusalem without a fight. An army was being raised in Egypt and would soon march north. The Crusaders had to be inside the city before it arrived, or they would once again find themselves caught between high walls in front and a relieving host behind, this time at the very end of their road, within sight of everything they had crossed the world for. The siege began in the second week of June, 1099, and it was harder than they had feared. They spread themselves around the city as far as their small numbers would stretch. Raymond and his southern French on the side facing Mount Zion, Godfrey and the two Roberts and Tancred along the northern walls. they could not close the ring, and from the first day they faced two desperate shortages. The governor had ruined the wells and cisterns for miles in every direction, so that men sweltering through a dry June suffered badly from thirst, sending parties far out into the hills for water and losing them to ambush on the way back. And worse, for an army that needed to break into a fortified city, the country around Jerusalem was nearly bare of trees. Without timber, there could be no siege towers, no rams, no engines to throw stones. Without those, the walls might as well have been the walls of heaven. They tried anyway, and far too soon. In the middle of June, after only a few days, they threw themselves at the defences with what little they had cobbled together, which amounted to a single scaling ladder. It was hopeless. The defenders pushed them off without much difficulty, and the failure made plain that courage on its own was not going to open this city. Relief came, as it had at Antioch, from the sea. A small fleet of Genoese and English ships put in at the port of Jaffa, carrying food and supplies, and something far more valuable: craftsmen, tools, ropes, nails, and timber. The Crusaders broke up the ships themselves for their wood, and foraging parties ranging deeper into the hills found stands of trees the defenders had overlooked. With that material, and with the skills of sailors and engineers who knew how to use it, the army set to work. Over several weeks they built two great wooden siege towers, tall enough to look down onto the ramparts, along with a battering ram and engines for throwing stones. It was done in the full heat of July by men who did not have enough water and who were harassed by sorties while they worked. But it was done. Then, before the final assault, they turned once more to their faith. A priest reported a vision in which Bishop Adamar, the beloved leader they had buried at Antioch, told the army to fast and then to walk in procession around the walls, and promised that if they did it in true devotion, the city would fall within days. On the 8th of July, the whole host, barefoot, carrying their crosses and their relics, walked in solemn procession around Jerusalem, while the defenders lined the battlements above them and jeered and mocked the symbols they carried. The procession ended on the Mount of Olives, where Peter the Hermit and others preached to them, and where the quarrelling leaders were urged in front of everyone to put their rivalries down and stand together for what was coming. For once, they did. The decisive assault came in the middle of the month. On the night before, both wings moved their towers into place, and there was one clever piece of misdirection. Godfrey's tower was taken apart and shifted under cover of darkness to a stretch of the northern wall the defenders had left more lightly held. At dawn, the attack began in earnest, and it went on through 2 brutal days. The Crusaders pushed their towers up against the stone through a storm of arrows and rocks, while the defenders poured down fire, flaming pitch and naphtha that clung to whatever it touched and burned, trying to set the great wooden machines alight. On the southern wall, where Raymond pressed his attack, the strong defences gave almost nothing. But on the north, on the 15th of July, Godfrey's tower ground at last up against the rampart. A wooden bridge came down from the top of it onto the wall, and across that bridge the first men scrambled onto the battlements. The chroniclers kept their names, 2 Flemish brothers first over. Godfrey himself was among them soon after, with a foothold on the wall of Jerusalem. Once a handful of men held a stretch of that rampart, they fought their way along it, cleared a path, and threw open one of the gates. The rest of the army came through, and the defence that had held so stubbornly for so long came apart in a matter of hours. The Fatimid governor and his personal guard fell back to the citadel, the strong tower beside the western gate, and there he negotiated his surrender to Raymond, handing over the tower and a large sum of treasure in exchange for safe conduct out of the city for himself and his men. They were among the very few who were allowed to leave alive, because the city had fallen, And what the Crusaders did next has darkened the memory of the First Crusade for nearly 1,000 years. After 3 years of suffering, after the plateau and the sieges and the burial of so many companions, and now lifted into a kind of frenzy by victory and by the conviction that they were reclaiming the holiest ground on earth, they fell upon the people of Jerusalem and killed them. Muslims and Jews, fighting men and unarmed civilians, the old, the women, the children, through the streets and into the houses. Many of the Muslim inhabitants had taken refuge on the Temple Mount, in and around the great mosque, and there they were killed in large numbers. The Jewish community of the city gathered in their synagogue, and it was set alight with them inside it. The Crusaders' own chroniclers described what happened in terms so extreme that later readers have struggled to credit them, and modern historians still argue over how many thousands truly died, and how far the figures were inflated by writers determined to convey the completeness of the conquest. What is not in question is that a massacre took place, indiscriminate and prolonged, and that it appalled even some of those who only heard about it afterward. And then the Crusaders did the thing that sits at the strange and troubling centre of this entire story. The surviving leaders and soldiers, many of them still marked from the streets they had come through, went in procession to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's tomb and the spiritual destination of the whole pilgrimage. And there they wept. They gave thanks to God. They prayed in joy and gratitude for the mercy that had carried them all that way. They saw no contradiction in any of it. In their own understanding, they had purified the holy city and recovered it for Christ. And what they had done in the streets was part of that purification. To the Muslim world, and to a great many people looking back since, the image of pious men praying in a city they had just filled with the dead became the defining memory of the crusade, and the damning one. The killing at Jerusalem was remembered in the Islamic East for centuries, a wound that shaped how an entire civilization understood the Franks who had come out of the West. But the thing was done, and the goal was reached. On the 15th of July, 1099, after 3 years and 2,000 miles, Jerusalem was in Christian hands, for the first time in more than 4 centuries. The impossible thing an aging man had called for in a cold French field had come to pass. A conquered city, though, is not a governed one, and almost nobody had given serious thought to what would follow the victory. Who would rule here? How would a few thousand exhausted Westerners hold a city in the middle of a world that wanted them gone? And out of Egypt, even as they prayed, an army was already marching north. So with the city barely quiet, the leaders faced the question they had spent 3 years avoiding. They had Jerusalem, and a thin sliver of land around it, and no government, and no agreement about who should lead. They gathered to choose a ruler, and the honour was offered first to Raymond of Toulouse, the senior man among them. He declined. He would not, he said, wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. It was a beautiful line, and it may have been genuine piety, and it may equally have been the pride of a man who had been eclipsed by Bohemond and left holding a relic nobody believed in any more. Whether anyone pressed him very hard is not clear. The choice then fell on Godfrey of Bouillon, the steady, devout duke whose tower had been first against the wall, and he accepted. But Godfrey too refused the title of king. He would govern, he said, only as defender of the Holy Sepulchre, a protector of the holy places, rather than a monarch in the city of Christ. So the first ruler of Crusader Jerusalem governed without a crown, and a Latin churchman was installed as patriarch to lead the church in the conquered land. There was no time to settle into any of it. The Fatimid army came up from Egypt as expected, a large force under the caliph's powerful vizier, marching to take Jerusalem back and push the Franks into the sea. And the Crusaders, rather than sit and be besieged inside a city they had held for a month, marched out to meet it. In the middle of August, 1099, near the coastal town of Ascalon, They came down on the Fatimid host and caught it before it had properly formed for battle. The fighting was sharp, and the victory was complete. The Egyptian army scattered, its camp was taken, and the threat to the new conquest was broken. Ascalon is usually counted as the end of the First Crusade, the last hammer blow that secured what the long walk had won. Even there, the leaders could not stop quarrelling. The town of Ascalon itself was willing to surrender, but only to Raymond, whose word its garrison trusted, and Godfrey would not hand his rival that prize, so nobody took it. Ascalon stayed in Muslim hands for another half-century, a thorn in the side of the very kingdom the Crusaders had just made, which is a fitting last note for an expedition so often slowed by the pride of its own commanders. With the vow fulfilled and the city safe for the moment, most of the Crusaders simply went home. They had sworn to reach the Holy Sepulchre, and they had reached it, and now they wanted the families and the fields they had left behind years before. The two Roberts turned back toward Europe. Raymond followed eventually, by way of Constantinople. Only a few thousand chose to stay and hold what had been won, a small Latin garrison clinging to a strip of hostile country at the far end of the world. It was a dangerously thin foundation. They built on it anyway. Godfrey did not live long to defend his city. He died in the summer of 1100, barely a year after the conquest, and his death raised at once the question he had spent that year avoiding. His brother Baldwin, the same ambitious younger son who had stood inside a shirt with an old Armenian lord and walked away with Edessa, came south to claim the inheritance, and Baldwin had no scruples whatsoever about crowns. He was crowned the first king of Jerusalem, and under him and those who followed, the conquest became a genuine kingdom, with a court, laws, coinage, and all the ordinary machinery of a medieval state, transplanted improbably into the Near East. That kingdom was one of 4 Latin states the Crusade left scattered along the eastern Mediterranean, in a region the Westerners came to call simply the land beyond the sea. The county of Edessa in the north, Baldwin's first creation. The Principality of Antioch, the prize Bohemond had schemed so hard for. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south. And soon a fourth, the county of Tripoli, built along the coast by Raymond of Toulouse and his heirs. Together, they made a Latin Christian presence in the Muslim East that endured, shrinking and embattled, for nearly 2 centuries, until the last of it was extinguished with the fall of Acre toward the end of the 1200s. The men who had led it came to varied ends. Bohemond, who had traded Jerusalem for Antioch, was captured by the Turks not long after, and spent years a prisoner before he was ransomed. He never recovered his early brilliance. He went back to Europe, launched a war against his old adversary Alexios, lost it, and died without the great kingdom he had always imagined for himself. Raymond spent his last years laying the foundations of Tripoli, and died before the city itself fell. And Peter the Hermit, the strange little preacher who had set that first doomed wave walking, outlived nearly all of them, went home to Europe, founded a monastery, and died quietly in his own bed, which is more than could be said for the tens of thousands who had once pulled hairs from his donkey and followed him east. The deeper consequences ran far beyond any of these lives. This was, as it happened, the only one of the great crusades to fully achieve what it set out to do. The expeditions that followed over the next 2 centuries mostly ended in failure, frustration, or disaster, which only made this first improbable success shine brighter in the Western memory. It enormously enlarged the prestige of the papacy, proving that a pope could summon and steer the energies of all Christendom. It opened a long age of holy war. It produced new institutions, among them the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, brotherhoods of warrior monks who grew up to guard the pilgrim roads and defend the new states. It reshaped the world in ways nobody standing in that field at Clermont could have foreseen. The Italian merchant cities that had carried supplies and soldiers east, Genoa and Pisa, and above all Venice, won trading privileges in the eastern ports that helped make them the commercial powers of the coming age, and the traffic between east and west quickened the flow of goods and ideas and learning in both directions. The relationship between the Latin West and Byzantium, never warm, curdled into lasting bitterness. The suspicions born in a golden throne room and hardened outside the walls of Antioch festered for generations, until a later crusade, in the early 1200s, turned aside from the Holy Land altogether and sacked Constantinople itself. A Christian army broke the greatest Christian city in the world, and those 700-year walls finally fell to men wearing the cross. And in the Muslim East, the conquest of Jerusalem and the killing that came with it left a wound that did not heal. In time, it helped call forth a counter-movement, a gathering of strength under leaders who preached the recovery of the Holy City, culminating most famously in Saladin, who would take Jerusalem back before the same century was out. So the thing that began with an aging man's voice in a French field meant at first only to send a few paid soldiers to help a worried emperor recover some farmland, became one of the most consequential undertakings of the medieval world. It moved hundreds of thousands of people. It killed a great many of them. It founded kingdoms, ruined the friendship between two halves of Christendom, enriched merchant cities, frightened and then galvanized the Islamic world, and fixed in the Western mind an idea of holy war that would go on echoing for centuries. The men and women who walked that road did not understand the forces they had set loose. They could not have. They believed they were on a pilgrimage to save their own souls and to recover the city of God. What they actually did was change the shape of the world, not often in the ways they intended, and very seldom in the ways they hoped. And that is the story of the First Crusade. From a quiet request for help, to the storming of Jerusalem, to the long shadow it laid down behind it. If you are still awake, the road goes on somewhere else, whenever you feel like following it again. There is no rush tonight. Nothing further is asked of you. Think, if you like, of that first small moment. A field in the south of France in the autumn of 1095. Cold air, flat light, an old man speaking to a crowd for less than an hour, with no idea at all what he had begun. Everything that followed, the walls and the lake boats, the thirst and the snow, the towers and the banners and the long, dusty miles, all of it still folded up inside a single voice on a quiet afternoon, unheard, unhurried, waiting. It is all a very long way from here, 900 years of distance between you and any of it, and none of it asking anything of you now. So let your shoulders drop. Let the room go soft around you. Let the story keep walking on without you, down its long road, while you stay exactly where you are, warm and still and safe. Close your eyes. Let the day go, whatever it held. Rest easy now. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.